Folks, I'm James, and I love urban sketching, as you can see from these sketches here. And when I think of urban sketching, I think of a particular look and feel, always with pen or a pencil, and sometimes with light watercolor washes, but always with traditional media and always on traditional paper sketchbooks. But in this video, I want to show you a different approach to urban sketching using Procreate, not as a replacement for traditional media, but as a kind of urban sketching teacher that's always by your side, helping you improve faster than you can with traditional media alone. And as a bonus, the techniques I'm about to show you will improve your professional presentation skills as well. Now, I currently teach iPad drawing at UCLA, but I have also made hundreds of urban sketches over the years, although we just call them sketches and plein air paintings back in the day. So as a person who has worked hard to master both traditional media and Procreate, and who continues to put them both to use in my practical day-to-day work as architect and renderer, I hope you feel like you can trust me. Now, this video is about how Procreate can help you become a better urban sketcher. So I've decided to couch it in terms of how Procreate helps you overcome the most common fears that both new and experienced urban sketchers have. But let's start with the most common fear all artists have, the fear of making mistakes, and how that fear can stop you from even getting started. And the good news here is that you can completely ignore that fear, because Procreate allows you to use two fingers to undo any mark you make by simply tapping the screen once, or you can hold those fingers down to undo all the marks you've made for as far back as you want to go. And if you go too far, you can tap with three fingers to come back one step, or hold three fingers down to come back all the way to the present. And when it's so easy to undo things, you will experiment more, you'll sketch more, and you'll stretch your abilities more. The next common urban sketching problem that Procreate can help with is how to translate what you see in real life into a sketch on a physical page. And this fear can be broken down into three separate fears: the fear of composition, the fear of proportions, and the fear of perspective. And Procreate helps with these fears in at least two ways: with Photoshop-like layers that let you take advantage of the age-old art of underpainting, and with a perspective drawing assist feature that allows you to set your vanishing points, then literally draw in perspective. Now, these two go hand in hand, but let me demonstrate them one at a time. There's nothing new about underpainting. It's been used by artists for thousands of years as a way of blocking out their compositions using thin layers of paint. And the reason it's been around so long is because it's much easier to begin visualizing what you see in a loose wash made with a paintbrush than with a thin and very finite line made with a pencil. The brush creates shapes and random textures that begin to suggest volume and depth, whereas the pencil leaves nothing to the imagination and either gets the shapes of the scene right the first time, a very difficult thing to do, or ends up being erased and reworked many times. For instance, here I am trying to compose my sketch on paper using a pencil. It's difficult to compose the view in profile, working from the outside in of all the objects, with only a single line. And it's likely I'll have to erase the line and go back over it many times to get the proportions and perspective right. Whereas with the Procreate underpainting approach, I can just choose one of these cool textured brushes, adjust the width and opacity, then start to kind of push and pull loose, suggestive washes to approximate the view in my mind. It's like a Rorschach test in the sense that one starts by making a kind of ink blot of the scene, then steps back, squints, and begins to recognize the scene they're drawing inside those shapes. I can even select and transform sections of these washes until they get closer to the image in my mind, in a process more akin to sculpting in clay than tracing with a pencil. And as a bonus, because I've used a highly textured brush to create the underpainting, I can begin to imagine the details I'll be drawing in the random textures and happy accidents of the brush strokes, but we'll get to that in a moment. If using a textured brush to get started isn't your style, you can just as easily use what I call the select and fill method to create the first draft of your underpainting in literal seconds, tapping the selection tool, then freehand, then color fill, then loosely outlining your initial draft with a marching ants, closing the loop, and voila, an instant black and white draft of your composition, ready to be refined by you like a sculptor using a clay knife, erasing and cajoling the shapes into a closer approximation of the scene, using the many editing tools at your disposal. Remember, this is all just the underpainting step, with more steps to come. I'm not suggesting that these quick operations look good, but that they are a great way for overcoming your fear of composition and getting something down on paper so you can begin to react to it and begin that feedback loop between your sketch, your eye, and your hand that is a part of all art. Now that we've discussed underpainting, let's address the next fear most urban sketchers have, getting the perspective right. My friends who teach urban sketching tell me the number one problem aspiring urban sketchers have is understanding perspective and getting it right in their sketch. But Procreate has a feature called Perspective Drawing Assist that can make it much easier to figure out the proper perspective of any scene. The process starts with stepping back, squinting your eyes to look at the underpainting, then adding a layer and lightly tracing the perspective lines that begin to emerge from what I will continue to call the Rorschach ink blot of your underpainting. Now you can add a layer and use the technique of drawing a freehand line, holding down the tip of your pencil until that line snaps straight, and rotating the end of that line until it lines up with one of the parallel lines suggested by the ink blot. Then draw more lines the same way until enough of them begin to cross in the same area. Then mark that approximate point to be used as both your vanishing point and your horizon line. And the horizon, for those who don't know yet, is the same as the eye level of the artist, and the point from which you will subsequently estimate the scale and proportions of everything else in your sketch. You can now tap the wrench menu, tap Canvas, toggle on Drawing Assist, tap Edit, tap Perspective, then tap once over your vanishing point, and you have set up the groundwork for sketching the rest of your composition in perspective. Now go to your Layers menu, slide back the opacity of your previous guideline layer if you wish, add a new layer, and continue to use either the underpainting brush or a pencil or a pen brush to flesh out the next biggest details in your sketch, using more of what I call the placeholder smudges to represent people, trees, building details, what have you. And keep an eye at all times on the relationship of these details and those people to the horizon line and the underlying perspective grid, so the new layer of freehand details stays in perspective and begins to be more accurate in terms of scale and proportion. With this last phase of underpainting complete, let's move on to see how Procreate can help you overcome the next most common fear felt by urban sketchers, the fear of drawing details. We've already talked about how underpainting with Procreate's textured brushes can generate happy accidents and random textures that help you compose your sketch. But these same happy accidents can help you compose the details of your sketch more accurately, even if you've convinced yourself you don't draw well. To add this next layer of detail, I like to go into the Layers menu and add what I call a layer of trace. That's a new layer with the color white just dragged and dropped on top of it. Then I go into the Layers menu one more time and dial back the opacity of that layer of white. Then I add a new layer on top of that, which will be the layer for my first bit of sketching. Pick the color I want to sketch with, pick a favorite pencil, in this case the Narinder pencil, test the size of the pencil and the opacity, and then I look for a good place to start. Whatever's comfortable, whatever makes my hand comfortable resting on the screen, and I'll just start sketching these details in my usual way, always with an eye toward the perspective grid that's there lightly underneath. Now, I could have just as easily activated Drawing Assist in that new layer and started literally drafting my final sketch, and I often do this when my aesthetic of urban sketching is not an issue, and I'm just trying to make a record of a building I'm studying in the field, for its proportions, say, or the arrangement of windows, the composition of that building. But for most artists, this is your chance to give your sketch that hand-drawn aesthetic that you have most likely already developed over a number of years. Because I no longer enjoy holding my breath as I try to trace long, perfect lines, I've developed what you see here, what I call the scratchy line technique, where I create longer lines out of many smaller scratches that I still think look good, but that make it easier to find a comfortable position for the heel of my hand as I work my way around the iPad screen, something that becomes even more important when you're standing in the middle of an urban plaza. If you have previous art training and or lots of urban sketching experience, great. But for those of you who are just starting out, consider doing what I did when I first started and visit every second-hand bookstore you can find. Buy used copies of every classic book on the subject of pencil, pen and ink, or watercolor rendering. These books will teach you amazing techniques for drawing details in the most economical way, using as few lines as possible to suggest the textures and the light that make or break a sketch. Just remember that I wouldn't be able to spend so much time enjoying this drawing phase were it not for the speed of the Procreate underpainting process that got me here so quickly. Which brings me to the next most common fear faced by urban sketchers, and how once again Procreate comes to the rescue, and that is the fear of shadows and the fear of color. For most time-pressed urban sketchers, shadows and colors are something you may get to at the very end of a sketch if you're lucky, and usually as some very thin washes of watercolor made just before closing your sketchbook, running together as you close the pages, packing up your palettes and paint, and dashing off to catch that urban sketching tour bus before it leaves. The problem, of course, is the lack of time. But Procreate helps with these fears by making it easy and fast to apply shadows and colors in a very brief time. But before we learn how to do it, let's briefly remind ourselves why it's such a good idea to have shadows and colors in our urban sketches. In short, shadows and colors are the tools we artists use to create powerful feelings and emotions in our work. Pencils are good at recording the perspective details of these moments, but shadows and color give us the ability to record how we felt in these moments, and fortunately for us, Procreate makes it possible to add shadows and colors in insanely fast and fun ways, so you will never be short for time again, and you can add a whole new dimension to your work. Let's start with shadows, and in the place of the word shadows, I'm going to use the fancier art history word chiaroscuro, which refers to the treatment of light and shade in every part of your sketch, and also sounds much cooler than shadows. A simple way to think about chiaroscuro is as the underlying light and dark values of any painting if that painting were desaturated. For urban sketching purposes, chiaroscuro can be used to both lead the viewer's eye into your sketch, to focus the viewer's gaze on a part of your composition, as in the church steeple in this sketch, or to add depth and rhythm to a sketch, as in the case of these dark leaf ball shadows receding into the distance. There are two ways Procreate makes it easy and fun to play with chiaroscuro. The first is what I call select and fill, and I use it to quickly create the shade and shadow effects in all my urban sketches, as in the case of the shadows in this view. I say quickly because you can generate shadows like these and even more complicated shapes in seconds. Just tap to add a new layer, change the layer blending mode to multiply so you can see the detail underneath, choose a cool gray that will contrast with the areas hit by sunlight, tap the selection tool, then tap freehand, then draw the outline of the shadow shape you want with the familiar marching ants. And here I usually include both the shadow that is cast on the ground by the buildings and the part of the building that will be in shade. Then either drag and drop or fill the shape from inside the layers menu with the current color in your palette. And voila, instant amazing shadow. And because the shadow is on its own layer, you can change the hue, saturation, or brightness using the sliders in the adjustments menu to maximize the effect you want, or use the eraser with a soft brush to lighten the parts of the shadow where light reflected from the sky tends to soften the contrast. And for those of you who like to live dangerously, there is even a third way whereby you can activate the color fill button at the bottom of the menu, and then as soon as you finish the dots, that color will automatically fill in. But I don't recommend that for beginners because after you've used it once, as I just did, it's easy to forget that it's on, hidden away down here at the bottom of the selection tool, and you can really become confused when the next selection you make suddenly fills itself in. It's not too hard to see how Procreate can help create a single grayscale shadow, but how can Procreate help you add color if you haven't worked with color before, or if you've only ever worked with a limited palette of colors that come with the typical urban sketcher's watercolor set? And the answer is by making it easy and fun to experiment with color using the hue, saturation, and brightness sliders in the adjustments menu and the palette modes at the bottom of the Procreate palette menu. For example, if you want to choose the best color to represent how our medieval tower seems to glow against the blue Mediterranean sky, add a new layer under your pencil sketch, pick a good color for the sky, and don't worry, you can always change it later. Then use the select and fill method we just discussed to add that color, tapping the selection tool, then the freehand button, then tracing the shape of the sky above the buildings. Then go into the Harmony color palette, note the color that appears opposite the blue dot of your sky, then tap that color to select. Then use select and fill again to apply that color to your tower. It may not be the right color or the final color you will use, but it will show you what color, as determined by the physics of light, will create the maximum glow or vibration when placed next to the blue you chose for the sky, and serve as a great starting point for the color part of your sketch. In the same way, once I decide on the color I like for the medieval tower, I can tap the brush icon, then tap the color picker square all the way over here on the left. Then I can go into the Harmony palette and get help choosing or modifying the color of the big, dark, cool shadow I used earlier to frame the composition and create the mood I experienced at lunchtime on that particular day. The colors suggested by the Harmony wheel may be too extreme, but with every experiment you will learn more about the physics of color, and every time you use the hue, saturation, and brightness sliders in the adjustments menu to adjust those colors in real time, you will become better at picking colors the first time. Once you establish the colors you use most often, you can tap the plus button in the palette drop-down menu and add them to your own custom palette. And don't worry, you'll still find yourself adjusting these saved colors in order to meet the conditions of light at any given moment. But collecting your favorites into your own palette will save time checking the Harmony color wheel every time you want to change colors. Now I'm going to quickly finish the color part of this sketch. It's going to take a little too long to share with you in this video, but I will make this file available as part of the assets in the description below this video. So you can open up the Layers menu and study the sequence of layers I've created, and you can also re-watch this as many times as you want using the video replay feature of Procreate, and just use your finger to pause it or move it forward or backward, and it's a fascinating way to keep learning in Procreate. But that brings us to the last bonus chapter of this video and how Procreate addresses what I call fear of the dark, or more accurately, how do you capture the feeling of twilight in an urban sketch? Now, there's something magical about paintings that capture the effect of twilight and moonlight, and they always make me ask the same question. How the heck did they do it? How did they lay out a painting in the dark? How did they pick the right color to represent darkness when they couldn't see the colors on their palette? And of course, the answer is they didn't. They took notes while they were in the moment, and then they went back to their studios to test their notes and make their paintings. But it's still amazing, right? And then it hit me. I can do the same with Procreate, and it will be much faster and much easier to do than it is with watercolor. So with your kind permission, and to finish out this video, let me show you my method for instantly creating twilight renderings out of any of your daytime sketches, and as I say, doubling the fun that you have with urban sketching and doubling your pride in a day well spent urban sketching. Now I'm going to show you the simplest version of this, and to start with I'm going to go back to the gallery and duplicate this daytime drawing. I'll swipe to the left, hit duplicate, and this is so I can have a safe version of this in case I want to come back to the daylight. So I'll open up this duplicate, and now I'm going to do one thing by way of preparation, and I'm going to take these blue windows and I'm just going to lighten them, and you'll see why in a moment. I'm going to go, I might even give them a little bit of a yellow glow, like electric lights in the evening. So I'll brighten that, I'll add that electric glow, and this is just a guess on my part that that's going to do it, and I hope so. So I'll close that now, and I'll go back to the layers menu. Now the key to these twilight views, the key to getting over your fear of the dark, as they say, is to add a layer at the top. Now I touch the multiply blend mode, because whatever I add to this, I want all the details underneath to be seen. Now I'm going to pick a color, and I'm going to use a classic blue gray or gray violet that I use for this twilight effect. And I'll tap here on this one. And now I'm just going to drag and drop that color over the entire view, okay? Now that's not exactly the right color, so I very often will go into the adjustments menu and hue, saturation, and brightness, and immediately give that either a cooler cast. I think I'll go a little cooler and a little darker, just to really pump up this effect for you. And saturation is good. We can always come back to that, just like every color. We can come back and adjust that later. Now that's my twilight layer, so to speak. And now the trick is to transform that layer in a couple of different ways. First of all, I'm going to go for the big move. I'll go back to my window layer, tap on that layer, and select that layer. And now you can see each of those is selected around those windows. Now I'm going to go back to my twilight layer, and I'm going to use a 3-finger swipe to cut and paste all those window shapes out of the twilight. Now that turns them into an opaque layer, which you just need to fix, or you can now dial that back with the transparency. And this is something I try to avoid, the transparency, but in this case I think it's going to be effective, and we are just trying to show you the abbreviated version of this. So there are all my electric lights, and I can give them varying degrees of transparency. And let's just do a good ambient amount of glow in the background for the moment. Now the next step is to go into the eraser brush and pick a good eraser. I tend to use the soft airbrush, and you can see that that's that shape. And the first move I'm going to make is to take away from some of these windows. Remember, I'm still in this window layer. So as I erase parts of this window layer, notice how they glow even more. And certainly the windows down at the retail level are going to glow the most, because that's where we want to make people come in and attract them in this beautiful hill town. This could be Siena or something like that in the evening. Now the next layer, they're going to be people that are home in some of these windows and not in others, but it always looks good to at least have the next second floor to be glowing. And I'll tend to make them glow from the bottom up, so I'll erase it from the bottom up. Now this is some kind of a special thing here. Maybe it's a theater on the second floor, so it's got the big window, and we'll make that special. And then we'll come back here and make sure we get these windows all the way at the end of the piazza. And then I'll just sort of randomly hit the other ones. And this is all according to taste, and you'll develop this skill as you go. So let's do the next layer, which is the twilight layer itself. And this is what's going to make the street glow, okay? And you can see here that I've got this shadow that I still have from my daytime view, the shadow on the street from the sun coming over this building. So I'm going to go ahead and eliminate that. Turn that shadow off. There it is right there. I'll turn that back on. And I'll turn this off too, which is my under layer for that building. So that shadow's gone now. And now I'll go back to the twilight layer and use my soft eraser brush, and watch as I erase away from the windows out to cause that glow, okay? So there's a general glow at both sides of the street from that soft light spilling out, and then there's a general glow that comes back up here on the top of these buildings, the bounce light from the street and that kind of thing. And I'll just gradually work that again. If I go too far, I can just use 2 finger taps to come back. Let's start there. And then we know that this distant piazza is going to be glowing quite a bit. So I'll start to make all of that glow, at least the bottom layer of it, okay? And the same will be true of these buildings back here. They'll glow from the bottom up where all the life is on the street. Now the tower is slightly different, and I'm going to go to the textured eraser, the Nicky Roll eraser, and you'll see in a moment why, because I'll adjust it to be roughly the width of that tower, and then I'm just going to run that up the tower, and notice what that does. That texture of that brush takes away only part of the twilight layer, so it actually looks like stonework glowing in the distance. And everything's a bit yellow for my taste, but we can fix that in a moment. And let's do the same with some of these buildings in the foreground, okay? So I'll give them the once over. I'll try and make it, maybe the texture is a little bit bigger. So you're really painting, literally painting with light, okay? And let's go back to the flat marker. And let's run that flat marker on the inside of some of these windows, and maybe even over the window a little bit more. So that starts to bring the window alive. It starts to give some depth to that window. Let's give some depth to that arched opening there. And we're going to go and take some of this twilight out of these people so that they're glowing a bit more, and it looks like they're glowing from the overflow from the street. I can add a little highlight to these planters, and again take more out from the very leading edge of those people so it looks like they're glowing from bright lights inside. And now what I'll do is I'll come up above that twilight layer and I'll make another layer. I'll do the same thing with the darken or multiply blend mode. I've still got my violet gray selected, and I'll go back to the selection button in freehand, and this time I'm going to activate that dangerous color fill button, and I'll show you why in a moment. I'll raise this up so we can see it. And now I'm going to use the spontaneity of the pencil creating these selections. It's much more spontaneous for me than it is for drawing something carefully. I'm going to use that spontaneity, and I'm going to start to lay in the shadows that would be caused by these shoppers as they go by in front of these bright lights. It's really kind of a silhouette thing. And I love this, and some of you that have seen my YouTubes know that I use this quite a bit because it just seems to create such a natural looking shadow, because I can't really control what I'm doing, and so I don't get overly tight about it. And I'll come back on this side of the street and add this. So again, you can see it's fast, it's spontaneous, and you are literally painting with light, and you are turning one of your valuable daytime sketches into a twilight sketch in just minutes, which should be doubling your fun and doubling your learning and doubling the pride that you're taking in your emerging and growing urban sketching skills. You'll find a transcript of this video along with a copy of the original Procreate files I used in the demos, so you can download them to your own iPad, explore the order and contents of all the layers, and use the video replay feature in your app to watch, pause, and replay every one of the making of these images, and all at your own pace. And if you'd like to learn more about how Procreate takes your urban sketching and professional presentation skills to the next level, check out the online course I offer called the Procreate Accelerator. It's the fastest way to learn Procreate and bring all the benefits of iPad drawing to your personal and professional lives. Thanks all of you for watching, and I'll see you in the next sketching retreat.